All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome back to another day of the Crop Hour webinar series. For anyone new here, my name is Shelby Pritchard. I'm the IPM specialist here at SDSU, as well as the moderator for this series. Once again, appreciate you taking out time of your morning to be here with us today. A few quick reminders: there will be a short poll after the speaker is done presenting today. It's just a couple of questions. We'd love for you to fill it out. We will also have a CCA credit available at the end of the talk, and feel free to ask questions throughout the presentation. We will have one speaker today, Christopher Graham. Christopher obtained his BS in Geography from Arizona State University, his MPA in Environmental Science and Policy from Columbia University, and his PhD in the Crop and Soil Science Department from Cornell University. Since 2013, he has been the assistant professor and extension agronomist for SDSU and is located at the SDSU West River Ag Center in Rapid City, South Dakota. And some of his research focus is on water and nitrogen use efficiency in dryland farming systems. And today, Chris is going to be talking about spring and winter pea production in South Dakota.
Thanks, Shelby. Let's get this going here. Does that look okay?
That looks good to me.
Okay, great. Well, yeah, thanks again for that introduction. As Shelby said, I'm Chris Graham. Currently, I'm a associate professor and extension agronomist in the plant science department. But my larger role these days is manager of the West River Research Farm, which we opened a few years back. And so that's based out at just east of Sturgis, near the Buffalo Chip Campground, if you're familiar with that. And this picture here on the left is showing you, this is one of our fields there with some field peas early on in the growing season. And you can see Bear Butte there in the background. So that's kind of where we're situated. And it's also kind of my, when I'm talking about a lot of these things, this is sort of my bias, I guess, is the western half of the state. And so a lot of the data that I present is gathered from, basically Pier, the river sort of west. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. We're talking about field peas, just kind of a soup to nuts presentation on growing field peas. And the audience, I suppose this is, I think because it's a low acreage crop, I'm gearing it towards new growers or just interested growers. There's a lot of great potential for field peas, and we'll talk about why to some extent, as we go through this, but it's a great rotational crop. And it's a great way to diversify crops, and the markets are expanding too. I think people are changing dietary habits, and peas have become kind of a growing player in a lot of different markets. So just as some background, the field pea production in the upper plains is basically in these two markets. We'll talk a little bit more about them. They're green and yellow peas. Typically, they have some end use differences in different markets, and prices fluctuate between the two. Some years greens are more, more valuable than yellows, and vice versa. But the lion's share of peas that are produced in the plains are these yellow peas. So they're much more widely or more familiar, I think, to a lot of growers, a lot of markets. And in our program and our variety trials, certainly the stuff that's entered in by the companies is majority yellow. But we'll talk a little bit more later on about some of those differences. As far as where these peas end up, the majority of the peas that are produced in the United States are exported mostly to India and to China. And, like I said, increasingly, the peas have been consumed more domestically. And the market, in recent years, some of the, because it's a global market, peas are subject to these fluctuations. Sometimes it's things like tariffs, and other export import barriers that we run into with every commodity. And so, the peas suffered a little bit, like for the Chinese market with recent tariffs. It seems to have gotten a little bit better, which bodes well for the increase in pea demand. But there's still restrictions in India and elsewhere. And so, what's happening with these peas, and sometimes they're directly consumed, just as whole peas, milled into flours, especially in India. But more and more where we see this is this fractionation for protein. So, they basically take the pea and split it apart into the protein, the starch, and the fiber, and each of those has a new end market. The protein in particular, it's used to fortify snack foods. It's used for these health foods. When you see, protein on the label, look at the protein and see where it comes from. Sometimes it's peas, sometimes it's soybeans, sometimes it's other things. But peas are increasingly gaining that market. In the bottom picture there, that's actually a milk that I saw at Target. It's just a pea milk. So lots of other new and unique ways to consume peas. And then, of course, the dog food market is another area where a lot of pea protein goes. If you look at the labels on dog foods, often see pea protein in there. And of course, the meats, the meat substitutes. Beyond Meat is a pea protein meat. And so those types of things are gaining in popularity as well. It also goes to food aid. So we ship a lot of this. This picture in the top left here, I was in Ethiopia a couple years back and walked into this big warehouse, and there was just bags and bags of these split yellow peas that they were distributing to, for food aid. And we'll talk about a little bit more about the split. That's kind of important. That's a kind of a secondary market. And then there, it has for a long time been a forage used as forages. And so, it's kind of a nice way to break up your starchy grasses with a little bit more high protein forage and field peas. And they do make a quite a good, both a grazer and as a forage supplement. So this is kind of a map. This is actually 2 years old or so now. But this shows where a lot of the pea production happens in the United States. As you can see, those darker colors, the darker reds, are where the highest acres are. And if it showed Canada on this map, it would be, you'd see lots of dark areas up there because Canada is the major producer. But really, what that tells you is you can see there's this. It's kind of a northern crop. It's well adapted to cooler climates of the northern and shorter growing seasons of the northern plains. So, North Dakota, Montana, Eastern Washington, and Idaho are dominant players in the pulses as a whole, but peas in particular. Now you can see there's some production in South Dakota, and it's fluctuated a lot. I think it's dropped more recently, but I'm hoping to see that rebound. And actually, it's interesting because the development is you've seen a lot more acres in Minnesota and Nebraska. So it's like it's developing around us, but the uptake in South Dakota has been low. And I don't know if it's market access or what, but there certainly is a lot of opportunities. As I said, I think peas are a nice kind of a gateway pulse. As opposed to, say, lentils or chickpeas. All the pulses are a bit finicky, and the peas, though, I think are the easiest one to kind of get a feel for and to get a sense of how these things grow. One of the biggest problems is disease. We're fortunate that we don't have a lot of disease yet, but soil-borne diseases can be quite severe with these pulses. And wet, humid climates are also conducive to a lot of disease. And so that's when I say Western South Dakota is a great opportunity. It really is a nice climate for low disease, low pest production. So the growing season, I often say it mimics the spring wheat season. Typically hoping to plant early April or so, and harvest in July, similar to spring wheat. Yields are even very similar. If you get 40, 50 bushels of wheat, usually that's about where you get for peas as well. So seeds will germinate above 40 degrees Fahrenheit. And they have what's known as a hypogeal germination. And so basically, in its simplest sense, it means that the growth point or the cotyledons stay below ground. And why that's important is that one, when that growth point is below the soil surface, it's more tolerant to frost. And two, it protects your reproductive area of the seed, and also it protects the growing point from early other stressors. Let's say clipping or even a graze. In a lot of these, the opposite would be epigeal. And so that's where the growing point is above ground. And so if that gets grazed off, then it's done for. But hypogeal can recover from those early season traumas, whatever that might be. And so as a result, though, they do allow for cooler temps that we sometimes get in April and even May. The downside to that, though, is that these early leaves, these cotyledons are not above ground, and so they're not photosynthetic. And so the advantage in other crops that do that is that they grow a lot faster. And so the downside to peas is that they have a very slow germination and early growth period. And so that can be problematic especially for weed control, which we'll talk a bit more about later. Shelby, I should add, if we have enough time, if people want to ask questions while I'm talking, and you feel free to interrupt me, that's perfectly okay. We can do that as we go.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay, so this is looking at some planting. So seeding depth, are typically looking at 1.5 to 2.5 inches. Seeds are fairly large. If you can get into a 1/2 inch of soil moisture, that's ideal. They imbibe a lot of water, and they swell, maybe 70, 80, 100% of their size. And they're bigger than a soybean. And so typically, it's important to get down into depth with these. Shallow plantings we've seen just don't do very well, mostly because the drying and the wetting cycles at the very top soil surface just aren't conducive for germination. And then seeding rates, we typically target about 350,000 seeds per acre. And just to give you, what is 350,000 seeds? So seed size ranges from 1,600 to 3,000 pound or seeds per pound. And so, of course, there's a lot of variation in varieties, but it ranges from 140 to 180 bushels, or 140 to 180 pounds, which is 60-pound bushels, so 2 to 3 bushels, depending on seeding rate and seed size. So these two graphs that I'm showing here, we've done a lot of work on seeding rates for these peas, and you can see on the left-hand axis here, this is the yield, and this is the seeding rate in thousands, so 200,000, 250,000, all the way up to 450,000. And typically, when I say this 350,000, this is kind of what I mean, or where that number comes from. There's a increase, it increases and hits, starts to plateau up here around 350,000. Probably not a big difference between 300,000, but maybe, at those lower rates, anywhere from 5 to 10 bushels difference. It's not extremely responsive. I think we see higher responses in wheat, for example. But still there is, like I said, there is some yield increase. The other value that I think that it adds, and where some of this yield comes from is is that higher populations typically compete a little bit better for weeds. As I said, they're slow goers, and so those cool season weeds that we have are those winter annuals, horseweed, mare's tail, or kochia in the spring, even Canada or Russian thistle and prickly lettuce, some of those as well. They get a jump on these peas, and so it's important that canopy closes. And so once peas get going and they establish, they canopy quite well, much better than say chickpeas or lentils. And so having a little bit higher seed population, I think, is conducive for weed control. Down below, this bottom graph is the same rates. This time it's looking at protein, and really all that this is saying, you can see these bars. I should mention that in these boxes. The bars are the averages, and then these the 25th and 75th percentiles are the boxes. So those bars, though, show that really there's not a lot of protein difference at different seeding rates, because that's always a question people want to know, is how does seeding rate affect protein? And so it's generally pretty flat. So planting date, as I said, typically if you grow spring wheat, you know that later in April, it's starting to get late planting, and then of course into May, and then you're really starting to get into trouble. And peas are the same way. I have the insurance dates as April 30th, and I did not confirm this, but I thought it was going to be extended to May 5th this year. And so I think that happened, but I can't confirm that. So these data here, this is just showing a bunch of different varieties and how they react to like an early or an on-time planting date versus a late. And this is kind of an extreme example we did a couple years ago. But I like it because 2019, if you remember, was a fairly wet year, and so we had pretty good yields, and so growing conditions were pretty good even for a late condition or late planting. But all in all, when you look at across all these different varieties, you can see from this April planting in blue, and then this is the same variety later planting, and you see on average it was about a 65% reduction in yield. And some of these varieties respond differently, like Shamrock, you can see it fell way off. But typically the trend is if it yields higher in the regular on-time planting, it'll yield higher in the late planting. But certainly major reductions. And like I said, this is kind of an extreme example, but even in mid-May, we still see quite significant drop off there. And the problem really, it's not so much, it's not the germination. They're going to germinate faster if you plant it late, obviously. So you have this, there is a way, you're kind of splitting the needle a little bit in that the warmer the soil, the faster it'll germinate, the faster it'll start to canopy. But the problem is, the more you delay that maturity, the more you delay your flowering into that hot, late June, even early July timeframe, and that's where your yields are really going to be affected. So that's what this is kind of showing. Flowering typically begins about 40 to 50 days after emergence, and there's a range there, like I said, depending on the soil temperatures. That's where that range comes from. But if you think about that, when do you want flowering to happen? Ideally it would be in earlier June before our heat really sets in. And the different temperatures, cool temperatures, let's say late March, early April in our climate, it could be 17 to 21 days before the seed emerges. Whereas it comes down, 7 to 10 days when you have 10 degrees higher. One of the things that does allow, from a producer's perspective, is there is some time, if let's say you're behind on your burn down, for example, your weed burn down, depending on your risk aversion, there is some time to go in, between your seeding and your emergence to clear up some of the weeds. I'll talk about that more later, but weed control is just so critical with these plants. And so one value there with that slower germination is you do have extra time to get in there in that pre-emerge period to clean up weeds. So as I said, field peas are extremely sensitive to heat at flowering. And this study here, it just shows, it shows the different, basically they induced heat at different flowering at different temperatures. And so you can see it's relatively insensitive to about 86, 90 degrees is where it really starts to stress the plants. And then you can see when they raise it to 97 degrees, the seed to ovule ratio is really the thing that we're looking at there. And that's basically the potential for the seed to produce. And so, like if you have, basically they're saying 70% of the ovules were turned into seeds. Whereas here it was reduced to just over half. And so those extended heat, and we've gotten it probably, I don't know, 3 or 4 out of the last 5 years, it seems like flowering time, you get these days of just 95, 96, up to 100, and so we definitely do see it. And that's a critical part of timing these things. Of course, it's mostly out of your control, except in the sense that an earlier planting can give you, increase the odds that you might see some cooler temperatures during the day. But take home message here is that flowering in under high heat, sustained heat is one of our biggest yield reductions. So let's talk about harvest. This is a pretty critical component, and lots of different opinions and theories on how harvest should be done. One thing that with harvest or with the commodity itself is that there's no futures market. And so when you're looking at marketing these grains, there's a lot of opinion on, should you just take the spot market when you get it, take it out and go sell it, or can you store it? And you're dealing with all these different variables for these things. And so typically, like to harvest at less than 20% moisture. Seeds are, there's a lot of telltale signs for when you should harvest, but seeds are firm and you can't pierce them with your fingernail. This isn't like, snap peas where you can just pull them off and eat them. So shatter is a real major concern. And so again, it's one of those things where you got to kind of split the difference. Peas are indeterminate, meaning that if the conditions are right, they'll continue to flower or put on new flowers. And so dry down can be a bit of a tricky issue. But once you get down into that 10% moisture or so, shatter is a real problem. And so some of the things that we can do with the combine, there's 2 things. One is your shattering is just you're losing it on the ground. But 2 is, so let's say you get it into the combine, then you need to minimize the splits, because especially for the whole pea market, obviously they're looking for complete seeds, but splits are a big issue when it comes to grading and when it comes to selling those grains. And so these things are kind of obvious if you've grown any other, say, soybeans or anything, kind of the same idea. But with the combine settings, the cylinder speed is low, sometimes 400 or 500 RPMs. Fan speed is high, just because we want to get, that does 2 things. It clears out a lot of the junk, because if your fields are dirty, you need to get a lot of that green out of there. But also it can clear out some of the splits too that you don't really want. And I always say just open that concave up as far as possible, and then recalibrate as you go. You can always look in and see, well, maybe it's not threshing that well. We're still getting some seeds in the pods, or whatever. But but having that concave open is really important. People, I think, debate whether you should use the bar or the wire concaves, or how, sometimes they mix and match and all these other things. I don't really have an opinion on that, because ours is a research combine, and it only has one option. So, but there are some disparities in terms of what kind of concave that you're actually using. Desiccation is always a question that comes up. And so I said, there's a couple different reasons why somebody might desiccate the crop. And so I think it's a bigger issue in terms of the indeterminate nature of the plant. That's a bigger issue in lentils. In peas, for us, I would say 8 out of 10 times we never desiccate. And if we don't have to desiccate, I wouldn't do it. It's a waste of time and money and effort, and you have some other issues. Last year was a kind of a perfect storm of terrible events for us, in field peas. If you remember, it was dry. It was kind of a miserable year in general. We had some peas in the Pea area, and so the stands were miserable. Yields were going to be terrible, and then all of a sudden, at about harvest time, it started raining, and just to add insult to injury, I think. And so all of a sudden, you had these peas that were getting close to time to harvest, and then you start getting flowers on them. And so it starts to green up, and then you have a plant where at the bottom, you have a lot of brown pods ready to go. And then at the top, you see flowers and you see little pods. And so there are times when it may be necessary to desiccate. And so, typically some of the other things I have there is things that just cause uneven maturity too. So hail, disease, poor germination, late rains, all these things can do that. And so in some cases, people do decide to desiccate. I think the other big reason that people do that is just for pre-harvest weed control. Our weed options are relatively limited with field peas, especially if you're looking for something with longer residuals in many cases. And so by the end of the season, you do get a lot of things. We get a lot of prickly lettuce. You can see in that picture there, it looks like some red root pigweed and I don't know what else in there, but kochia is another one that comes late. And so what a lot of growers are doing is they want to put they want to do some sort of pre-harvest weed control to just so you don't have to run so much of that green through the combine. And I would say between the two options, if it's desiccating the peas versus pre-harvest weed control, the pre-harvest weed control is the bigger concern. Now, the issue there is, so what product do you want to use? And desiccants, there are some things like diquat is one, and AIM, which is carfentrazone, sharpen is another one. So some of those can be used, but obviously the first thing that a lot of people want to turn to is Roundup. And Roundup isn't technically a desiccant. It's not, it might help the crop dry down, but it's not used for desiccation necessarily. And so it's not intended for desiccation. It's intended for the weed control. But with peas, because it's directly consumed, there is this issue with these MRLs, the maximum residue limit. And so glyphosate is a big one that producers and end users are looking at. So there's a concern that some of these things, especially Roundup, is going to remain on the seed, and then it could get rejected, or it could have severe dockage or whatever the case may be, it's an issue is what I'm trying to say. And so it's really important to talk to buyers, to talk to whoever is wherever you're taking these things and discuss that issue, because it can be a major problem. And I think that issue is growing more and more in terms of what those residue limits are. That's kind of a moving target. And so I think it's really important to stay on top of that. So this is just a little bit more on some of the harvest. So that picture on the right there, that just shows basically the dry down and what these things kind of look like as you get drier and drier. And one thing, and one kind of old rule of thumb is that you can listen for the rattle. That's a good time to know when to harvest. And basically at some point as it dries down, it will, the seed will disconnect from the pod itself. And so you can kind of shake the plants and you can hear the peas rattling in the pod. And that's getting kind of, I always thought that's a little bit too dry in some cases. But it's one of those old farmer tricks. And so desiccation, I was just talking a little bit, if people are interested in that, typically one rule of thumb is it's about 3/4 of the pods are brown. And another question that always comes up is how do you combine these things? And so I know the flex headers, just a straight cut is by far the most common way to combine these. Traditionally, it was more of a swath and then pick it up later. But it's just much easier when you swath it. You have some issues with color, and you can get that call it dirt tag, where it kind of stains the dirt stains the seed coat. And so straight cutting it is definitely the easier route. Plus it's a one less pass that you have to make. And so the flex header is nice in the sense that you are often running that header pretty low to the ground. And so where you hit, whatever uneven terrain might be out there, there's lots of reasons for that, especially in our country. That flex header is pretty nice over that. The one area, in organic production, though, I think that's still where you do see some swathing. It's still common in organic production. Although, like I said, with peas, more so than lentils or even chickpeas, I think you can get away with the straight cut. And so it might be, again, if you're looking at organic production, it is kind of conducive for that kind of thing, because it's a little easier to harvest than those other pulses. So one more slide on harvest. Oops, that's kind of coming off there. I thought this is a really nice slide. So basically, it's important to note that the plant will mature from the bottom up. And so it's kind of the irony of this plant is that by doing so, you typically, some of your best yield in terms of pods on the plant is at the bottom. Those are some of your biggest peas. And so those are also the ones that are most susceptible to shattering. And so it's ironic, but you can see this is kind of from left to right here. The dates are obviously not important. This is from Australia, but you can see how the plant dries down. And where we're targeting, is sort of that, like I said, less than 18% is often a number that's thrown around, where you have, as you're going from left to right, you see there's a lot of green, and then it's starting to dry down from the bottom up, and then less and less green. And then at some point you start to see some of this, some of the lodging, some of it's falling down. But 95% maturity, 100% brown pods. And you can see the difference here. If you looked at all the peas on each of the pods, they have some that's, on average about 30%, and some that's about 12%. So that's where you get that more of an 18% on average. And again, all of your bottom pods are going to be really dry. Your top pods are going to be a less dry. But in these situations, vine lifters are really helpful. I know that, you know, some of those flex editors have the blade guards, which give you some extra clearance. But the vine lifters, in addition to that, is really quite helpful in getting under there and making sure that you get all that plant into the combine head. So weed control. One of the things about peas in particular, lentils too, is that our weed options are less good. There's a lot of perfectly good herbicides out there, but you know, if you're used to corn and wheat, it's not as good. So clean fields prior to, so really what a lot of people will say the time to control your weeds and peas is actually the year before, like say in your wheat the year prior, because especially when it comes to broadleaf weed control, your options are a lot more limited. And so I said this already, but the peas germinate, let's say 10 to 14 days after you plant them. And they have a very slow early growth habit. And so your winter annuals are the ones that are really killer. Again, the mare's tail, brome, kochia can be an issue. You know, some of these things, pennycress is another one. Those are the primary weeds that we see in this country that really have a lot of problems. And so I think a lot of folks in response to that have moved to more of a fall application or a split application, where you do see things like mare's tail or brome even that are starting to germinate in the fall. You know, obviously, I think everyone knows that the best time to kill a weed is when it's young. And so if you can clear out a lot of that in the fall, maybe you have something that has some residual. And so you get some of that early activity in the fall, and then, you know, most of these that are soil applied with the residual need some precipitation, ½ inch or whatever, an inch, to activate. And so you take advantage of some of those early season, you know, the snow melt and stuff that activates that, and then you have that residual that takes care of the newly germinated seeds in the early spring before you've had a chance for the peas to canopy. So fall application is a pretty popular weed control, or again, as I said, the split application. And then there are a few post-applied herbicides that I could talk about, but again, the window is pretty short when it comes to that. So a new node develops every 3 to 5 days in these, and so the staging for field peas is based on node development. And when this is important more for your post-emerge herbicides, where some of those you can't apply until you say the third node, usually like for some of those like Raptor, and then your window ends at flowering basically. So you have this window 3 to 5 days. Let's say, you know, flowering might happen at 11, 12, 13 nodes. So you could, depending on the season, this will change every year. If it's really dry, you know, the flowering will happen much earlier, fewer nodes, but you really only have for these post-emerge herbicides, I would say in our climate, you know, maybe 2 weeks or so that you have, maybe 3, of a window to go out and apply these things. So, and of course, you know, then these post-emerge herbicides work when the plants are the weeds that you're targeting are only, you know, 2 to 4 inches tall. So if you add that in there, then really, you know, sometimes it could be a week or just a few days that you really have. That's really the ideal window for applying these things. So that's why I guess I'm kind of hammering on the pre-plant weed control is really, really critical. And so this is a table from University of Nebraska looking at the efficacy of various herbicides, both pre and post emerge. And so one of the things I do like about peas in the rotation is it offers a really great opportunity to diversify your herbicides. More and more we're seeing that we're getting a lot of resistance to group ones, your ACCase, and your group 2 ALS, inhibitors. And so you're starting to see a lot more resistance to these. And so one area where I think peas have a nice fit is you can diversify that, and you can look into some of those, like you see in the pre-emerge herbicides, like group 14, group 15, group 3s, and then you have these multi sites of action. I would say, we use a fair bit of this broadax Spartan Elite, which we're pretty happy with. But Sharpen is another one that's big. Valor is not on this list. Valor is one that is very popular, especially for a fall applied application. And then if you look down here at these post emerge, there's a few that even do have some broadleaf action. Raptor is one that's a big one. That's Imazamox, which is the same thing as Beyond. So if you're familiar with Clearfield wheat or Clearfield sunflowers, Beyond and Raptor are the exact same thing. But it's always applied at this point. It's always recommended to apply it with Basagran. And you do get some broad spectrum control. Then you have others like Clethodim, which is Select, or Post, which have no control on broadleaves, but do a fairly good job with your grass control. Let's see here. So this is just another slide. This is one thing to point out, though, that with a lot of different weeds, there's some issues with residual, both what you applied, say, in the previous crop, and then what is applied within the field pea crop. And so one thing that the peas are really sensitive to things like clopyralid. So products like wide match in wheat, or even perfect match, which is also, it's basically wide match plus something else. Peas are pretty sensitive to that and have a pretty long rotation interval. I think with that, it says 18 months. But I think that some of that is just due to lack of research. But also Callisto, one in corn, that's a big one with Callisto. That's one that peas are very sensitive to. And so it's, again, when you're looking at further out into your rotations, make sure that you look at these herbicide intervals, because peas are sensitive occasionally. And then when you turn around and you look at some of these other ones that we can apply within the peas, how that affects the following year. One that I just talked about, Broadax or Spartan Elite, which again is sulfentrazone and metallochlor. You look at corn, field corn is 10 months, sweet corn 18 months, 12 months for oats, 10 months for sorghum, proso millet 12 months. And so some of these have a fairly long window. And it's typically okay, 10 to 12 months is all right, but where we, in drought conditions, these things have a tendency to stick around a bit longer. And so that can be an issue. So I guess something just to point out that these things, it takes a lot of planning in terms of how you're going to stage these. And then if you wanted to throw in a cover crop, for example, if you wanted to try to follow peas with a cover crop, which, as a side note, peas are a lot like soybeans in that when you harvest those, there's very little residue left on the ground. And so that can be a real problem for us when the wind blows and there's not a lot of armor there on the soil. And so cover crops do have some appeal if you have the moisture to support them. But again, you're going to be limited in terms of how you apply your herbicides. You might be limited to just more broadleaves in many cases for a cover crop mix. And so it can be a bit tricky to try to figure those things out. And this is just some data from Brian Jenks. He's a weed scientist up at North Dakota State. And this is looking at post-emerge grass control. So these are graminicides. So they're targeting the grasses, looking at select, which is the clethodim again, and then assure, which is a FOP. And so what these two graphs are showing is it's basically two different sites, one in North Dakota, one in Montana. And if you look at the label, you can apply select clethodim up to flowering, and same with assure. But some of these data are not super reassuring in that sense. So what this is showing is there's four different, they applied select and they applied assure to peas at two different times. So one, when the weeds are at 4 inches. This orange one is they applied the select 3 days before flowering, gray is 3 days after flowering, and then the yellow is a week after flowering. And the yield here is on the y-axis in both cases. And basically the pattern is assure, generally pretty low or negligible differences in terms of yield. So negligible in the sense that it's not hurting the plant, the pea plant itself. However, when you look at that select, even from 3 days before flowering, you still see, almost 500 pounds difference in yield. And then of course, as you get outside of flowering, then you see a lot of herbicide damage and pretty significant yield reductions there. So again, timing is really critical with those post-emerge. I didn't really mention it too, but they're also kind of expensive. And so, especially something like Raptor, if you've already applied something pre-plant and now you're going into a post-emerge, your weed control bill is really starting to add up there. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about fertility. This is an area that's near and dear to me and my research program. We do a lot of work with nitrogen fixation. So one of the greatest things about peas and pulses, legumes in general, is that they obtain most of their nitrogen from the atmosphere. And so sometimes there's a bit of a misnomer in that people think that the plant fixes this nitrogen, that the atmosphere is 80% nitrogen. And of course, nitrogen is the most critical nutrient for plant growth. And so the problem though is that all the nitrogen in the atmosphere has a triple bond, and so it's very stable and it's unusable by the plant. But these legumes have developed this ability to form a symbiosis with a bacteria called Rhizobia. And so the Rhizobia are these bacteria are actually the ones doing the work, the ones that are breaking that triple bond and converting the nitrogen to a form that the plant can use. And so the symbiosis here is that the plant typically forms a nodule, and that's what you can see in the picture here, these little weird lobe things. These are nodules, and they grow out of the root itself. And so the Rhizobia basically live in these nodules. They take in the atmosphere, and then they send the nitrogen up the root to the plant. And in return, the plant sends carbon down as energy for the bacteria. So it's a very mutual arrangement that they have. One of the things that is kind of diagnostic with these is, let me back up. So what that means from a grower perspective is nitrogen. I almost would rarely ever recommend nitrogen fertilizer. And in a climate like this, where nitrogen is 100% more expensive than it has been in the previous year, that's a really big deal. And so the thing though that you have to do typically, there is some native Rhizobia in the soil, but it's not enough generally to be effective in feeding the plant the nitrogen that it needs. And so you do have to apply some sort of inoculant, which is readily available and generally pretty cheap. And they come in a liquid, a peat, and a granular form. And so nodulation, typically, if you're looking at these plants, by 6 weeks or so, you should be able to pull up a root and see these nodules. And the way that you know if they're working or not is that they turn this reddish color. And that reddish color actually comes from this, it's called leg hemoglobin, which is more or less the same compound that's in our blood that makes our blood red. And the way that it works is that hemoglobin binds to oxygen. And so the Rhizobia need an oxygen-free environment to do their thing. And so that leg hemoglobin attaches to the oxygen and transports it out of the system. And in doing that, you get this reddish color. So when you see these nice red nodules, that's how you know it's working. Sometimes you see, like down here is this whitish color here. These are inactive, and sometimes they're just too young, haven't started nodulating. Other colors you get, there's some black. I can't see them in here in this picture, but black nodules are basically dead nodules. And then sometimes you see these green nodules, which typically is a symptom of some sort of stress. Usually it's moisture stress. And so they're not actively fixing. They're not necessarily dead, but they're stressed and not doing much work. And so, one question that often comes up is what kind of inoculant should I use? And, by and large, I think the majority of folks are using a granular inoculant. It's a peat granule. And one, as this graph is showing, generally just seem to see better yields with the granular. Here you're going from 70 bushels down to a liquid to 50 bushels. So major difference in this study, which was actually not much more effective than just putting the plants in the ground without any inoculant. The biggest difference really though is one, you can put the granular in with the seed box and it will kind of mix itself generally. It doesn't take much to inoculate the seed. And so that kind of the dust or the powder kind of settles over it. Whereas in the liquid applied, you have to have some sort of mechanism to apply that liquid. Sometimes people will put it in a starter fertilizer box or something. But also handling the liquid is a lot more tedious, and the liquid is a bit more prone to weather fluctuations. So these are live, this is a live culture. And so extreme heat will kill off a lot of your viable Rhizobia. And so, if you leave it in the front of the pickup for a while, it makes, it inactivates it. And so handling is a big issue with these things. And the peat of the granular is generally the most stable form, in my opinion. So one brief detour here, I'm running out of time, but we're seeing a lot more salient seeps in our areas. And so field peas, I wanted to bring it up. I'm going to move through these slides pretty quickly, but field peas are much more sensitive to salt. And so soil EC is what these two studies are showing. And this is increasing salt basically from left to right. And this is the relative yield. So at 100% yield, it's at, would be at considered the zero salt level. And then you can see this linear decrease as you increase in salt. And so field peas are quite sensitive to salt, much more so than looking at wheat, just comparing that. You see there's a little bit, it hangs on for a while. So it's a little bit more tolerant to salt, and then it starts to drop off pretty rapidly at some point. And that's the same thing with the Rhizobia too. We did a lot of studies. We are continuing to do a lot of studies. And basically these are different Rhizobia species. And so you have a control, which is zero salt in a broth. And then you have a 0.3. So this is like a low level salt, and then kind of a more medium level of salt. And some of these, you can see there's a big varietal difference. So this one just drops off immediately. This one, as you add salt, it still continues to hang on. This is basically what these bars are, is just showing concentration of live cells. And so all I'm trying to highlight here is that some of these, like this one, I mean, these species numbers are irrelevant, but some of them are very sensitive, and then some of them are more. So this is at even higher levels of salt concentration. These are some of our better Rhizobia. are a bit more tolerant to salt levels. And so that's one of our side projects, is where we're doing a lot of work trying to find Rhizobia that are much more tolerant to salty situations. So I got to move a little bit. Phosphorus, typically phosphorus, they won't respond much over 16 parts per million. Phosphorus levels are really critical to root growth though. And so obviously when the plant is relying on the roots for its nitrogen, for that fixation, the phosphorus is also really important. Some folks will try to put phosphorus with the seed, generally not more than 20 pounds though. It can affect stand injury. And typically though, 35, 40 pounds max is all that's needed. And I'll say, we don't have a great numbers, but oftentimes we don't see any response to phosphorus, even at lower levels than the 16 parts per million. Sulfur is not a very diagnostic test, so we don't talk about it much. Basically, if you've noticed sulfur problems in the past, then you might want to consider it. There is some response. I know they did some tests in Montana and they saw a response maybe 20 or 30% of the time. Potassium in our country, in our soils, always typically very high, and so we don't see much for potassium. And now last, I'm just going to close. So we do a lot of variety testing, and on the extension website, we post all of our results. And typically every year we have maybe 3 to 5 different sites. This is funded by the Pulse Council, and so it's a really great program. 30 to 40 varieties are tested. And so, we get maybe 4 or 5 different companies that usually submit seeds. And so I think it's a great resource for growers. And again, it's at this extension.sdstate.edu. You can just Google like SDSU field pea variety trials, and that will bring it up as well. This is kind of what it looks like. This is showing results from 2021 at Sturgis, which were pretty miserable, in the low 20s, pretty dry. Protein content, typically we'll publish 2 or 3 year averages where that's available. And so again, really nice resource. It takes a lot of work from our crew, and so it's a good resource, and it shows some of the differences. This one's highlighted in blue are generally the top performers, and like I said, you can get some longer term history there. Really quick, green versus yellow. Sometimes people ask which one's better. These are a couple of graphs showing 2 years of data. And basically this is green on the left, this is yield, and these two are green and these two are yellow here. So this was 2020. You see the greens, maybe, 5, 6 bushels lower on average than the yellows, kind of similar, lesser difference in the drier 2021 climate. So typically we see higher yields in the yellows. Maybe that's a sampling bias because we test a lot more yellows too. But this just shows some of the differences. Protein, I used to think that greens had higher protein, but these data are showing that really, if you look at red to red, blue to blue, actually yellow is a bit higher. But I think especially for protein, that's more of a variety specific and not necessarily green and yellow. Whereas I think we do kind of see this trend generally in yield, but protein, I think, like I said, I would pay much more attention to the variety specifically than whether it's just green or yellow variety. Now, 3 minutes left. One thing that I'm particularly excited about is the possibility for winter peas. So lately there's been a large breeding effort that trying to get winter peas. And so the reason that I love this concept is just like the reason I love winter wheat is because we can keep a growing plant in the soil for, that whole fall period and a much longer period, which I think is really critical. It serves almost a similar function as a cover crop does. It's a harvestable cover crop. And so we started to test these, and the big question initially was, well, can they survive the winters? And so we plant these, similar to winter wheat in late September, early October. They grow, they go dormant into the winter, and then they reemerge or start growing again in the spring. And so the season is very much like the winter wheat season. but the big question is, what can they survive our environment? And we did it last year, and we tested, quite a few different varieties. Some of these are the different varieties on the left. Some of them are names. A lot of them are experimental yet. And then these dots are the averages for each of those. And these are kind of the error bars, or like the 95% confidence intervals. And so you can see that the yields were a bit low. I think spring peas were 24 bushels. So some of them compete with the spring peas. Overall, it was kind of a miserable year to test anything. But the point here really is that they can survive. And that was like the first major hurdle. And then here's protein. Often we're seeing a lot, some higher protein contents with these, and is it a yield relationship? And I don't think it necessarily is, but we'll continue to trial these. We got them out this year, though, so that we'll have a second year coming up this summer. And so I'm excited about the prospects here. I think we have some things to learn yet, and continue to see which varieties work in our climate. Can they survive those really tough winters? And initially, we can say yes, they can. And we'll continue to see them. So I'll go ahead and end there. This is my contact information. If anyone has any other questions, email is certainly the best option. But happy to take phone calls as well. And Shelby, I guess I didn't pay attention if we had any questions.
I didn't see any questions, but there was just a comment from Martin who said that he had some issues this year with Callisto carryover in peas from previous corn crop.
Yeah. Thanks for that's not good to hear, but yeah, I think it's one thing that we're getting smarter on too, is which herbicides really. There's just a lack of information and a lack of research, especially on those like corn as it migrates west. Starting to see more and more how these, what kind of carryover are we looking at? And Callisto seems to be one that's really popping out as one that's really problematic.
And then I'm going to ask you to stop sharing your screen so I can throw up that CCA credit. Sure. And while I'm doing that, there was a question, where can you sell at?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So they're directly in the state, I know of Purus, which is a protein. Well, they're a protein company, I guess, but they will contract directly with growers. I'm not. I don't have any official claims to any of these. I'm not, but I know that Purus does do contract growers. I see from Martin, ADM is another one that sources some. I know there's some that have come up out of Nebraska as well, and so and local co-ops will take them on a limited basis too. So I think they are around, and certainly the suppliers, like say, the various seed suppliers can certainly connect you with where these might grow or where you might be able to go post-harvest. And so the markets are available. I think it does take a little bit of shopping around. And I see Martin's got a couple there as well. One thing I will say, I forgot to say it earlier, is that handling peas in a cold climate, like let's say in January, is really of concern, because you have a tendency to crack those peas in those really cold climates. And so I don't know. If you can avoid it, I would wait till a warmer day to move peas if they're in a bin. And if you have a belt conveyor, which maybe not a lot of people do, that would be ideal for loading and unloading these things. And if you're using a regular auger, just slow auger speeds to minimize those cracks is really important.
All right. And if there's no other comments or questions, I think that is all for today. So we appreciate you presenting today, Chris. And we hope everyone joins us tomorrow when we will be discussing oats.
Great. Thank you very much.